Hi. Have you
Hello.
met Professor Majeed? Have you met Professor Majeed before? Professor Majeed, my collaborator, Professor Hans Harder.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Hi, Francesca. Where are you? We can't see you. Hi.
Half an hour.
Yes.
Half an hour.
Right.
Okay, good. No, I had a slight shock. I thought I had got my timing wrong. Hi, Hans. Hi, Javed.
Hi.
Everybody. Good.
Okay, I think it's time.
Yes, please start.
I welcome once again all of you on the third session of the day, plenary session. Mirza, Sadaf, and Ruchi Nagpal are the rapporteurs of this session. Please take over, Mirza, Sadaf, and just proceed.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the second session of day one of our conference, Language, Ideologies, and the Vernacular in South Asian Post-Colonial and Colonial Literature and Public Sphere. This is our plenary session in which we have two guest speakers, Professor Javed Majeed and Professor Francesca Orsini. The session would be chaired by Professor Nishat Zaidi. Nishat Zaidi is Professor and Head, Department of English, Jamia Millia, Islamia. Her research interests include post-colonial writings, Indian literature in English translation, comparative literature, and women's writing. A scholar, critic, and translator, she has 10 books and a number of published papers to her credit. She has co-edited Story is a Vagabond, Fiction, Essays, and Drama by Intizar Hussain. She has guest edited 2 special issues of the review journal, The Book Review. Her translation of Day and Dasta is her most recent publication. Welcome, ma'am, and it's over to you now.
Thank you, Ruchi. It's indeed an honor for me to welcome Professor Javed Majeed, whose scholarship I have long admired. In fact, I mean, it's strange that, I mean, it's funny, strange, or coincidence that every time, whatever I work on, I find, myself referring to Professor Majeed's works. So that speaks volumes about the range of his scholarship. Professor Majeed is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at King's College London. From 1981 to 1984, Professor Majeed studied at Magdalen College, Oxford. He has done his PhD from Oxford, and then he has also, had postdoctoral fellowships at various universities, and he has research fellowship from Churchill College, Cambridge, from 1988 to 1992. His range of interest, as I mentioned, is quite wide. The interdisciplinary combination of area studies with English literature sort of informs his teaching. He, after teaching comparative literature and Urdu at SOAS, he moved to School of English and Drama at Queen Mary University of London in 1999. It's difficult, for me to read out the list of all his works because it's wide range of publications. But some of the books that I can possibly mention here are, autobiography, travel, and post-colonial identity, Gandhi, Nehru, and Iqbal, which was published in 2007. The very important book, Muhammad Iqbal, Islami Aesthetics and Post-Colonialism, which was published in 2009, and his book with Isabel Hofmeyr on India and South Africa, which was published in 2016, and then his, again, very important work, which is a 2-volume study of Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India, which was published as Nation and Region in Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India in 2018. So it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Majeed. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Nishat, for that kind introduction, and also for organizing this conference, and to your conference team, because I can imagine what a huge amount of work had to go into it. So thank you for inviting me. So basically, I'll take about half an hour, and I just want to begin by saying my paper has 4 main themes. The first is I want to consider the global context of the changing relations between English and Indian languages in the subcontinent. And my argument here is that the global context means we need to distinguish the colonial legacy of English in India from other factors contributing to its dominance with the spread of neoliberal doctrines since the 1980s and the liberalization of the Indian economy since then. So there are in fact two dynamics in play here. And it's the second dynamic I'm going to focus on, which is the spread of neoliberal doctrines since the 1980s and liberalization. And then the second theme I'm going to concentrate on is the question, what are the factors which enable the English to appear neutral in certain contexts? And I'll discuss what that means, the term neutrality. And then thirdly, throughout, I consider how the kind of English vernacular binary mystifies key aspects of language politics in India. And finally, in a utopian mode, I consider ways in which we may be able to move beyond the English vernacular binary. But this is only suggestions, really. So let me begin by saying it's something obvious, but it's kind of important to put it on the table, that in approaching this relationship between regional languages vis-a-vis English in India, we can't take simply a South Asian centric or nation centric approach, because the status of English as a global lingua franca has had an important impact on these relationships. And moreover, the so-called regional languages in India are themselves transnational languages because of the South Asian, the spread of South Asian diasporas across the world. So regional languages themselves are, if you like, have been internationalized. And the other thing I just want to say is that the spread of English as a global language, it's important to stress this, is actually a world historical phenomenon. And moreover, as Grodol noted in 2006, this spread has meant that the function of English has changed primarily from communication between non-native and native English speakers to communication between non-native speakers. So that's quite a difference we need to keep in mind. So the relationship between regional languages and English in India has to take into account this changing function of English, as well as it's the world historical phenomena, it's spread as a world historical phenomenon. And also we need to think about global factors which have operated since the end of the Second World War. So Philipson and de Swan have argued that it was only after 1945 that English became globally dominant. And they link this to the decisive rise of the US as the major global power of the advanced capitalist economies. And one sign of this is there's been some good work done on how in the 1950s and 60s, American foundations and institutions laid the groundwork for MBA programs and management studies in India, in which English became the language of management studies and reflected the extension of English as a global phenomenon. And also, I would argue it's also likely that the context of the Cold War played a role in the sponsoring of management studies in English as part of a diplomatic and cultural policy of expanding US influence and capitalism against the Soviet bloc, especially given India's non-aligned foreign policy in the period. So but this global dominance of English has been reinforced, as many of you know, by the spread of neoliberal free market doctrines from the 1980s onwards, which has naturalized the use of English as the language of global competitiveness. For example, after the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis and the IMF-led economic restructuring in South Korea, English was promoted as the medium of instruction in higher education because it was seen as a key index of competitiveness and as the inevitable side effect of globalization. And similarly, in Singapore, the decision to make English the official language was motivated by its perception as a mark of global competitiveness. And the switch from French to English in Rwanda as a medium of instruction in 2008 was partly justified with reference to English as the language of globalization and the need to attract foreign direct investment in the service sector. So I just pointing to these other examples to make it clear that we need to read the dominance of English following globalization in India alongside other examples from other parts of the globe. So it's just the case of India is just one case amongst many, and it's kind of worthwhile maybe at some point developing a comparative study of this. So the naturalization of English as the language of global competitiveness is obviously evident in India, with the patronage of US-style management studies in English has reinforced the spread of neoliberal free market doctrines, particularly after this liberalization of the Indian economy. And also I think it's important to remember the preference for English as a global lingua franca has been conditioned by and correlates with the expansion of the digitalized knowledge economy. Hence, as Sontag argued, leading entrepreneurs in the Indian IT industry view English as an index of globalization. And because languages have often been taken to index peoplehood, culture, selfhood, it's kind of important to think about how English has come to index a different set of factors, namely globalization. And moreover, its dominance in Indian business and management is seen as a sign of the Indian economy coming of age. So there's a kind of another indexicality at work here in relation to the language ideology of English. Because as many of you know, language ideologies are about how languages index other kind of social processes and processes of identity formation. So what effect has this had on the relations between English and regional languages in India? So Frankel has described India as an enclave economy with islands of excellence distributed between regions, states, and urban and rural areas. And referring to the enclave economy and these islands of excellence, he discusses the productive knowledge-based sector involving some 15% of the population. And this, as you know, absorbs well-trained industrialists, managers, lab scientists, software engineers. It competes in the global market and has high iconic status. It obviously has high international profile, but it's concentrated in major cities in a few states, one of which is Bangalore in Karnataka. As you know, well, I need hardly tell you, it's one of the important centers of the business processing, outsourcing industries. But the result of this is that there are competing linguistic hegemonies in Bangalore between the local Kannada identity of Bangalore as a regional city and the cosmopolitan identity of Bangalore as an international metropolis celebrated by the city's bourgeoisie and the English press. And here, therefore, Bangalore is indicative of the predominance of English as a global language within a globe, how the predominance of English in a global language within a global labor market coexists with the existence of regional and state labor markets, where you have the upper lucrative levels focusing on the knowledge of economy and demanding a knowledge of English as a global language, and the lower levels of the agricultural and industrial economy operating in state and regional languages. So there's a kind of correlation between the language economies of Bangalore and the kind of the intersection between the global economy and local and regional and state labor economies. And also here, I think it's important to pick up some of the particularities of English as an index of globalism at work. In particular, what Duchenne and Heller call the linguistic Taylorism of contemporary global capitalism. In many ways, as Boutet has argued, language workers in call centers in India are in fact emblematic figures of late capitalism. And the key features of English language work in call centers have been well studied by many. These include accent reduction, location masking, scripting, and voice standardization. And this language work involves what Boutet has called extreme merchandising of speech. the extreme merchandising of speech. So call center operatives in India are in fact English language workers who, through accent reduction and neutralization in multiple senses of Indian English, are converted into a resource, as Mirchandani says, they're converted into a resource that can face the customer in any part of the world. And as she goes on to say, we might think of call centers as nodes of language trafficking in English. So they are in fact nodes of language trafficking in English. They actually reinforce the spread of a particular type of global English throughout the world. These language workers in the call centers. So as the conference's concept note argues, a recalibration of the notion of vernacularity vis-a-vis language ideologies in relation to post-liberalization in India is required. However, if we recalibrate this relationship, it seems to me that we need to carefully distinguish between the colonial legacy of English from the key factors which have contributed to the dominance of English in India since 1945, without fully displacing the earlier post-colonial dynamic. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, without displacing the earlier colonial, post-colonial dynamic between Indian languages and English, the conditions of late capitalism after the end of the Cold War in particular have created another dimension to this dynamic. And we need to take this dynamic into account. There are other ways in which we can think about the global dominance of English, and one understanding of this global dominance and how it's reproduced has been enhanced by a world systems approach to language. So de Swan in 2002 argued that the world language system, there is a world language system, and that world language system has been held together, or is being held together, by English as what he calls the hyper-central language. And this has kind of features of, has oligopolist, kind of features of almost like an oligarchy. So what are these features? These features include privileged markets, communication savings effect, language learning savings effects. But more intriguingly for us, he compares language loyalty to brand loyalty. And this will lead me on to the second part of the talk. In other words, dominant languages in the world systems operate like prestigious brands. And so the reconceptualization of languages as branded goods is evident in how the post-war global expansion of English has been described in reports by the British Council, for example, as an asset comparable to North Sea oil, to quote the report, a world commodity, and to quote the report again, a brand highly sought after. So this reconceptualization of English as a brand by the British Council gives us a clear indication of the changing nature of language ideologies in late capitalism. Basically, language is marketed as a brand by powerful groups. This one also argues that users of dominant languages benefit from legitimization effects. That is, that if you speak a dominant language, you enjoy automatic advantages as a mother tongue speaker in situations involving negotiation, conflict, and competition. So in these situations, dominant languages are seen as intrinsically legitimizing. And I think the legitimizing effects accruing to English extend to its being posited as neutral in terms of conducting business in a language which transcends ethnic and cultural diversity. And in management studies, this neutrality has been reinforced by the invention of what's called business English lingua franca, or BELF, as a shared communication code within a global business community, in which, of course, Indians also participate, which is not tied to a cultural identity rooted in a narrowly defined ethnos. So, of course, just to very quickly say that it's interesting, again, just to compare Rwanda, because the switch from French to English in Rwanda was partly motivated by perceptions of French as tainted by its association with the Hutus and the genocidal Francophone government. So all I'm saying here is that in instances like this, political imperatives to use English, so political imperatives to use English as ethnically and culturally neutral, in inverted commas, dovetail with the dominance of English as a lingua franca in the global economy. So, you have these different factors kind of reinforcing each other to kind of create this idea of English as neutral. And of course, in India, aspects of the legitimizing effects of English as politically, ethnically, and religiously neutral operate in key domains. I won't go into the details here because I know the audience know this, but basically one way basically of therefore just thinking about the India case is how the political idea that English is neutral, hence the Indian constitution is framed in English, and that's the only legally admissible version of the constitution in the Indian courts that's referred to. But that idea of English as politically neutral reinforces, therefore, the idea of English as a global lingua franca and as an index of global capitalism. And I guess the other thing to think about here is that the historical legacy of Hindi and of course Urdu as well in the case of Pakistan, and the sensitivity of other regional language elites, especially in South India, to what they call as Hindi imperialism, are obstacles to it replacing English completely in all the domains in which the latter is used. And it also points importantly to the fact that some regional languages in India see themselves in competition with Hindi, not just with English, which further complicates the English vernacular binary, because you don't just have the kind of homogenized block of vernaculars versus this homogenized English in a binary opposition. In fact, within the so-called vernaculars, there is also a competition. There is also competition and conflict. And the obvious example here is how some non-Hindi speaking states support English in advanced education in order to equalize the opportunities of their regional elites in relation to elites from Hindi speaking states in the Union of India. So, and Tamil Nadu, as many of you will know, has gone the furthest in eschewing Hindi, and it has one of the highest levels of bi and trilingualism in English. So while English is a key component in the competition between established elites and emerging elites in India, it is also a key factor in the competition between the Hindi-speaking elites and the regional language elites. And some of these regional language elites actively support English in order to limit the power and influence of Hindi at a national level. And the English vernacular binary obscures this dynamic. If you just stick with that binary, it obscures this dynamic. So nonetheless, while the new centrality of linguistic form and practice in economic production has affected our ideas of language, and language and culture are increasingly treated in economic terms, this has not replaced older discourses which treat language as indexing cultural identity, allegiance, and peoplehood. So these older discourses are still in play alongside this new discourse. But, and as in South Asia, as the concept note has argued, it's the so-called vernaculars that are associated with these qualities and categories. However, I think notions of language as an expression of community and belonging, and of language as commodifiable product, are not binaries, as Duchenne and Heller have very persuasively shown. They coexist and are interrelated. The discourse of pride in which language is framed as a cultural heritage, as in the case of the vernaculars in India, and the discourse of profit in which language is marketed as a brand and as a means to material gain, are in fact co-constituted. They are intertwined with each other. And in fact, as they very persuasively show as a source of symbolic added value in the globalized economy, language is tied to the commodification of national identities and the marketing of authenticity. So these identities are mobilized in the construction of niche markets, and language is corralled into branding, and it becomes an index of the naming of places, people, and objects. In other words, the discourses of profit and ancestral pride are always dialectically interacted with in interaction with each other. And of course, in South Asia, there's another dimension to this. Given the multilingual nature of the subcontinent, in the political competition between established and emerging elites, language issues attain a high degree of saliency. But what this means is that in the competition between elites, language is both an asset and a symbol in the pursuit of economic advancement, social status, and political power. So in this competition, the combined discourses of pride and profit play a key role. And the political competition over official language and status is in part economic competition over public sector employment. And this fuels the political mobilization on the basis of language, particularly as the state sector in South Asia accounts for a larger share of GDP than in economically advanced democracies. And this increases the economic value of public sector employment for aspiring white-collar workers. And here, linguistic federalism is key in attempting to equalize opportunities to different language groups, as Sujit Chaudhary has shown in his article, I think, of 2008. So the investing of vernaculars in inverted commas with qualities like authentic groundedness and expressive strength in opposition to English's inauthentic globality obscures how vernaculars themselves are simultaneously constituted in terms of ancestral pride and community identity, as well as economic advancement and profit. And here I think it's worth noting Peter Ives's very insightful discussion drawing on Gramsci, arguing that Gramsci doesn't valorize what he calls the spontaneous grammar or vernacular languages as somehow authentic or natural, or even inherently more in tune with a particular group of people. Because for Gramsci, the vernacular is not necessarily free itself from unequal power relations, nor is it necessarily a natural expression of one's being in opposition to the artificial imposition of a normative grammar from a ruling class. In fact, he argues that the apparent spontaneity of the vernacular may not in itself be the result of free choice, but indicative of the subjugated nature of subaltern conditions. And indeed, some have argued that the positing of vernaculars as grounded and authentic forms of belonging, and hence in opposition to a free-floating global English, in fact reinforces a politics of identity which polices forms of belonging considered appropriate for subaltern groups. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about the hidden politics of that policing of the boundaries of political forms of belonging appropriate for subaltern groups through this idea of the vernacular. So as Babu has insightfully pointed out, Article 351 in the Indian Constitution is committed to developing Hindi as one of the official languages in the Union, but not English. And in fact, this perpetuates unequal access to English. And I would argue further reinforces elite closure around English, as well as maintaining the immigrant status of English. So I'm running out of time here, I think. I mean, how much? I have 5 minutes or so? Because we started.
You can take 5 minutes. You have 2 minutes although.
Okay. So the English vernacular binary also mystifies the way in which, as Kachru puts it, on the one hand, we have nativized English discourse, and on the other hand, we have Englishized discourse in South Asian languages. The binary, in other words, obscures how English has acquired functional nativeness in India, and how English in India has developed its own sub-varieties and regional variations. So the binary, in other words, obscures the socio-linguistic realities of language mixing in India, as well as the pluricentrism of world Englishes. Moreover, this binary, by attributing, I would argue, a permanent immigrant status to English, as well as a permanent colonial legacy status, actually makes it difficult to decolonize English. So the binary is actually kind of impeding the decolonization of English. Moreover, the way the two terms in English and the vernacular binary operate indicates that they share an ideology of nativism. So despite the widespread bilingualism in India, language movements and the very notion of linguistic states in India are premised on the category of the mother tongue native speaker, which has come under a lot of flack recently. For example, Yasmin Yildiz's excellent book, Beyond the Mother Tongue. Similarly, even though world Englishes are pluricentric, monolingual paradigms continue to cast a long shadow over the representation and teaching of English. So in both cases, English and the vernaculars, in both these cases, the figure of the native speaker is instrumental in defining the common sense linguistic boundaries of authentic belonging, in relation to which the non-native inauthentic speaker is posited. So I'll just say here, and then I'll go on to, say a little bit about how we can move beyond here. I mean, many of you will know Babu's 2017 article and Agnihotry's 2015 article. Basically, drawing on their articles, I want to argue that the English vernacular binary opposition is at odds with the hegemonization of both English and key vernaculars in the 8th schedule, which institutionalizes a particular kind of hierarchical multilingualism in India. The listing of languages in the 8th schedule has opened up a competitive interlingual dynamic between amongst the so-called vernaculars in India, and the English vernacular oppositional binary obscures the hierarchical and hegemonic form of multilingualism defined by the state in India through the 8th schedule, with Hindi at its apex, but also this, I think, operates in conjunction with fluctuating and variable forms of hegemony created in different ways, which also includes English. So how might we move behind the English vernacular binary? And here I'll only take a couple of minutes. First, as Annie Montant has argued, what causes a language to be separatist isn't language diversity, but the notion of language as a monolithic entity, territorially bounded, and as an index of cultural identity and peoplehood. And this concept of language is tied to the notion of the native speaker. So we need to move beyond the notion of the native speaker. And one way to do this, as Aisha Kedwai has argued, is to capitalize on bi and multilingualism in India. Pervasive multilingualism engenders a positive attitude towards using and learning new languages. And the key point here is without prejudice to whether they are native to you community speakers or not. As every multilingual speaker knows, she doesn't have to use all her languages in identical domains for identical purposes. Okay, so I think that's important. Similarly, Annie Montant makes a very powerful argument for the recovery of grassroots multilingualism in India by drawing on the insights of Creole linguistics, which counters the reification of languages as objects tied to native speakers. She cites Da Silva to the effect that the Prakrits themselves could be seen in terms of the creolization of Sanskrit. And
sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need some time for discussion also.
Yeah.
So
Okay. Honestly, I'll honestly take 1 minute. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. So, and she also argues for the importance of horizontal contact in India, blurring the boundaries between genetic groupings of languages. And it is this which leads MNO to posit an Indian linguistic area in which all 4 original languages of India, all 4 in contact in India and the subcontinent share more specific features amongst themselves than any single one does in relation to an external member of their family. Okay, so I just thought it's important. In other words, she's arguing that Creole linguistics as opposed to cladistics might help us to move beyond the reification of languages in India. And now I really will just end here by just saying that the other thing that we just need to think about is that when we think in utopian terms, we need to think beyond national boundaries. And we can think of this, of course, in an obvious way, because the linguistic region, India, doesn't accord with the post-partition political map of the subcontinent, India. So, I mean, already built into the linguistic map is a utopian possibility of going beyond national boundaries. And the other thing I would like us to think about is, as Peter Ives has suggested, whether although the spread of English is rife with politics and power relations, might it have progressive potential? While English is a crucial element of an international business class structure, it is not always necessarily the case that global English will be connected to the apparatus of global capitalism. English might become the supranational language of human rights. Globalization has anti-democratic effects, but it has also resulted in the spread of a worldwide rights-oriented culture for which English has become the vehicle of articulation. So English can just as easily be an instrument in the democratization of global governance as an instrument in anti-democratization that characterizes globalization. So there is a kind of dialectical aspect to English here. And finally, and this really is the last point, thank you for your patience, we should not slide into the mistake of assuming that Englishization is a cause of global inequalities. Replacing English with another language, for example, in management studies, will not in and of itself change material or cultural structures of domination. So just as the vernaculars in India are not intrinsically connected to political freedom, so English is not intrinsically connected to global oppression. So I'll end there. Thank you. Because we began a bit 3 or 4 minutes late, so I gave myself a little
It's okay.
more.
Thank you so much, Professor Majeed. Thank you so much for this very lucid talk. And in a way, your talk has taken the discussion forward from the morning session, because in the morning session we discussed the territorialization of languages and the processes of vernacularization in the colonial and pre-colonial, mainly colonial contexts. So your talk has shed light on how English has come to index globalization and its implications. So without wasting any more minutes, I'll pass it on to the rapporteurs to take up the questions quickly from the chat box.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir, for the enriching talk. The chat box is full of questions, but because we don't have that much time, we'll just take some. We have a note, not a question, from Professor Francesca Orsini. That she says that Sazana Jayadeva has a book coming out in English training centers in Bangalore, where she worked and where students say that they have a language handicap because they were educated in Kannada. So this is okay. I'll just take another question. The usage, we have a question. The usage of the word vernacular carries some colonial baggage for denoting non-standard or not quite formed languages. Could you kindly explain the contemporary usage of the word vernacular vis-a-vis English? Are all languages vernacular? Are there better alternatives? Thank you for the generative talk.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we can, we don't have to kind of accept the way terms are handed down to us. I mean, I think that's a little bit of a red herring, because I mean, English is also vernacular. I mean, in relation, and actually, Samuel Johnson in his first dictionary, I was going to, had a section on that, was very kind of aware of that and had to, in his preface in 1755 to his dictionary and other writings of English, was kind of aware of English as a vernacular and had to kind of make a case for English deserving of a dictionary, rather as opposed to kind of Greek and Latin. So I mean, I think I'm not quite sure why we should remain kind of trapped in the idea that the vernacular is something necessarily at odds with this idea of English. I think there are two ways we can undo that distinction. One is to just point to the historical fact that English itself was seen as a vernacular before it achieved the status that it did. And I think, so if you like, dismantle that idea, but also I think the other thing maybe to consider here is what is in the idea of the vernaculars is that somehow vernaculars are modern languages. I mean, it's always surprised me in the British Academy how the English department is separate from the modern languages department, because I mean, after all, English is a modern language. So, all I'm trying to say is that we can kind of undo these binary distinctions, these oppositional distinctions, and in doing so, that will also help us to decolonize English, which is to stress that it is also a vernacular, and indeed it has been, if vernacularized, if we think of it, Indianized in the subcontinent as a whole, and B, that the other kind of relationship here is the vernacular versus the ideology of classicism. So not just the vernacular Hindi versus English, but the vernacular Hindi and Tamil versus Sanskrit. Okay, and so there's that other kind of relationship in play here. And so we also need to think about the ideology of classicism, which contributes to this idea of the vernacular. And I think we need to kind of undo that ideology of classicism as well. I mean, it seems to me the real evaluative binary here is not vernacular versus English; it's vernaculars versus Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. That's where the kind of evaluative binary is, and we need to kind of dehegemonize the, to my mind, oppressive ideology of classicism. That these languages are always being measured or somehow have to align themselves. They have to Sanskritize themselves or Persianize themselves, or So yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. We have more questions, but we are short of time. In fact, time is over. Thank you so much. Thank you for the enriching talk. I'll hand it back over to the chair. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Majeed. In fact, there are questions in the chat box, and what Sadaf is saying is that if you want, you can answer the questions in the chat box. Okay.
Okay. So I'll do that.
Now we'll move on to the next speaker of. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
We'll move on to the next speaker of the session, Professor Francesca Orsini.
Sorry, can I just say one thing? Sorry.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, really sorry. As a language worker in the university, unfortunately, I have to go and teach. So I'm sorry about that. I have to leave. I'm really sorry about that. Okay. But I'll look at the chat box later. Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to welcome Professor Francesca Orsini for the second talk of this session. Professor Orsini is one of the best known scholars of Hindi and South Asian literature. But more than that, she's a wonderful human being. And personally, for me, whenever I need any kind of, advice, help, I just turn to her. And without any hesitation, she immediately, comes forward. And not just does what I request her to do, but also goes beyond and helps in more ways than I expect. So thank you, Professor Orsini, for accepting our invitation. Professor Orsini she teaches at the SOAS, University of London. She's a fellow of British Academy and author of The Hindi Public Sphere, which is, of course, the iconic book. Most of us have read it and have benefited from her scholarship, Print and Pleasure, which was published in 2009. She has just finished a book on multilingual literary history of North India. She is leading the ERC research project, which I find very interesting, multilingual logos and significant geographies for a new approach to world literature. And she is doing it from the perspective of North India, the Maghreb, and the Horn of Africa. So thank you so much, Professor Orsini, for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And let me share my screen. Right. First of all, congratulations for this absolutely mammoth conference. I'm sorry again for the times I won't be able to listen to everything, but you have a wonderful set of speakers from many generations, which is great. So I want to focus on, I mean, as part of the project that I'm doing at the moment, I've more and more come to sort of think that apart from, of course, scholarly and, social linguistics, approaches to language, it's actually really useful and to follow what writers themselves, who of course, have to work with languages, think about their own language use. But before that, let me start with a couple of personal observations, just following up on also on Professor Majeed's points. So like Professor Charugupta, I also recently contributed to a small special issue of South Asian Review on the idea of the vernacular. While Charu was more enthusiastic, I had my reservations. And in fact, I let Subramaniam Shankar, who put together the issue, change my title to Flawed but Necessary. But actually, my original title had been Necessary but Flawed. Why? Why? Because for two reasons. Why? First, because it implies, of course, a relationship of hierarchy vis-a-vis the high language. But the term vernacular often, at least in India, carries this subaltern tinge of, it can appear as the radical underdog to the privileged entitlement of English, the salt of the earth, even though not as sophisticated. But in reality, as we know, the print languages that today we call vernaculars themselves underwent a process of standardization, and massive quantities of new coinages were pumped into them from different preferred high languages, in many cases substituting older terms that did not carry the right sound or pedigree. So therefore, and I'm thinking of Hindi here, when we write Hindi literature, we are actually reading a particular kind of language that is quite far from idiomatic spoken varieties that are spoken by the people. So, I mean, some of the questions in the chat already pointed to it, and of course, Javed also, that, we call them vernacular, but, vernacular, of course, is a big umbrella term that covers, both, I always say that, it's never the mother, the tongue of your mother that is valued when we talk of mother tongue. So I tend to prefer vernacular as an adjective rather than as a noun, no? So to avoid reification of the vernacular as actually something. And my second reservation relates to the historical trajectory of vernacularization that comes with the term vernacular. So, and while in a way in Europe, I think it was true that in the second millennium, Italian, French, Spanish, English, German gradually replaced Latin in most domains of language use, the same has not been true in India or South Asia, at least not to the same extent. So whether it was, when the high languages, when Sanskrit was replaced, Persian came, when Persian was replaced, but English came. So the result has been a continuing, for me, has been the continuing multilingualism, in which vernaculars have continued to exist with one or more high languages and with other regional languages. So vernacularization in South Asia has not created a single vernacular, or vernacular field or person. So for me, it's always important to think of language embodied in a person, and also language in space, in a place. And however much we may think of language as defining identity or as constituting a field, there is little to be gained by aspiring to monolingualism, or simply by thinking of languages in hierarchical or antagonistic terms, as a ladder, which one, where you go up and you discard the lower ones, the so-called lower ones, or another, metaphor that is often used in everyday language in India is the language camp. Which camp are you in? So if you're in one camp, then you must be obviously against another language. So to me, vernacular sounds like a promise of equality through language, which is all well and good, but too often translates into an attempt to deny the other languages that are around. Multilinguality or multilingualism recognizes that no language is an island and no language is unknown is enough. Sorry, yeah, that's what So in a nice essay entitled "What Would Bakhtin Do?", which I think we should all of us who work with literature should ask ourselves from time to time, Michael Holmquist, who was the translator of Bakhtin in English and a scholar, rejects the term multilingual, and that of course is something that linguists also do. Because he says it is grounded in the opposition between many and one, whereas the language of those who are said to speak only one language in the everyday sense of the term is already immersed in the ineluctable disunity and formal multiplicity that the necessary condition for having any language at all. So there's a systemic multiplicity at the heart of any spoken language. And in fact, linguists now prefer to speak of interlanguaging rather than multilingualism as a process instead of code mixing and code switching. Now, my view is that this heteroglossic and dynamic view of language is not antithetical to multilingualism. Multilingualism may seem an imperfect term, but I still find it useful because it incorporates interlanguaging, language ideologies that clearly demarcate languages and often pit them against each other, and everything else in between. In the case of India and South Asia more generally, and in Krishna's Sobti's ideas and writings, you find both. Yeah, and you might be interested in looking up the project of Stefan Helgesson at Stockholm University on vernacular, cosmopolitan vernacular dynamics in world literatures, because he takes the vernacular as a kind of starting point of dynamics within languages. Now to my topic. So given her often fragmentary and somewhat disordered non-fictional output, we have perhaps been discouraged from considering Krishna Sobti not just a master at her craft, but as a thinker on language. And she herself set herself up as a lekak in opposition to a chintak or a darshanik, and certainly from a pandit. But Rosina Will's painstaking study of her often dense and highly metaphorical speeches and essays makes a convincing case for Krishnaji as a deep and rich thinker on history, writing, gender, and language. So here I draw largely on Rosina's careful selection and analysis of her writings on language. Unfortunately, not published yet, but she's hoping to do so soon. So the first point is hearing voices. So she often describes her process of writing as coming after a sometimes year-long period of silent wait, or a long mosam, where the ruh par ka kapat band hai, and the writer is waiting for ahat, so for sound, for gungunahat. So there is khamoshi, and then there's the waiting for some sound. The wait is for voices, the voices of her characters. And she often talks of her characters through their voices and as embodiment of these voices. This was literally true, as is well known, of the voice that she heard from the sort of worker who in Rajasthan who became Mitro in Mitro Marjani. इधर तो देखना मती ठेकेदार जी लंगड़ों की मान में अट गए तो गाए काम से. And this is like the beginning of the whole character and the whole story of Mitro, but also of the complex subjectivity of Ratti in Surajmukhi and Dherese. If you think of it, the mother of Elarki is after all only voice, but through her voice she's able to recreate a whole existence and a whole structure of feeling. This is no mimetic, process. Rather, Sobti speaks of memory banks. Memory banks in English when she writes in Hindi, in which voices, expressions, and words are filed away. So whereas, for example, Nirmal Verma would emphasize the importance of seeing and develop the poetic of the eye, Sobti said that the writer should have ears to their eyes and eyes to their ears. कानों पर आंखें लगी थीं और लगी हैं. A writer assembles a whole world. लेखक एक बड़ी दुनिया को अपने में समेटे रहता है. The characters of Zindagi Nama, she wrote, came to her with their fully fledged voices. Zindagi Nama ka मौसम लंबा था, गांव की कांची गंध से कई सर्दियां गर्मियां महकती रही. So of course there's not just voices, there's also rang and sense. Majlision में घर गुंजान रखा, but you can see that voice and sound, and here are the characters who have just arrived as a gehri jano wala vishal zinda ruh, which is of course a key figure in the beginning, the poem at the beginning. The primacy of these voices means that the question of language boundaries, is there too much Punjabi or too much Urdu, is clearly the wrong one, for a writer cannot tamper with the voice of a character. She says, मैं भी उस भीड़ का अंग हूँ, उन्हीं में से एक हूँ, नहीं तो अपने शहराती ठस्से से उनकी खुरदरी चाल ढाल मोती देहाती बोली को समकालीन सुसंस्कृत मुहावरों की पौध लगाकर उस जीवन शैली का पठनीय अनुवाद करती चली जाती. I could have done that, but I mean that would have been tampering with their voices. And for me also really important here and interesting is how, though she was clearly an avid reader from a young age, Sobti recalls the magical evenings in which her father would read out to the children from across the raised parda, Urdu books like Pulwalon Ki Sair, Sadi's Bustan and Gulistan, but also Banking Anandmat, Premchand, Sudarshan, the stories of Durgadas Rathore and Banda Bairagi. So literary Urdu and Hindi, as well as Punjabi songs, proverbs, and so on, all became part of her oral world. So ek badi dunya hamare choti dimagon mein shor machane lagi. So again, it's voices. So, you know, what happens if you think of the Gulistan and the Bostan and Pulwalon Ki Sair as listened? So all these words and coming as voices rather than things that you only read or that you read. Second point is the power of words. Every word has a body, a soul, and a dress. Jism, ruh, and poshak. It's actually a word, I think is a, yeah, sorry, that should have come before. Har shabd ka ek jism, ek ruh, ek poshak hoti hai, is a sentence that she is repeated, in fact, in her essays. Like shades, colors, words have living faces, sajiv mukhre. Words have vichar kriyaen, and move towards human expression thanks to their linguistic power. Yes, that's how dense. What is a vichar kriya of a word? I think maybe it might be the next one. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Words recognize their own meaning through their faces. They represent those who are their painters. Words grasp intellectual personalities, Vaicharik Vyaktitva through language. Sorry, I think that's a later quote, which will come in a moment. But what is significant here is what an active force words are for Sobti, for whom the writer is rather a sensitive instrument, a medium through which words play. So the writer is played. The words describe the one who describes them. They also show how important it is for a writer, and this is really this quote, to know words well. Words belong to families, parivar, but also gharane, a term that suggests that aesthetics, style, and embodied histories are at stake too. Again, this has practical implications. So when she defends herself in, I think the second one is actually from Zindagi Nama, the essay about Zindagi Nama. Padikkana, Sambhakan, Jassa, Gahpati, Gahpatani, Rabrakha, जैसे असंख्य शब्दों का बहिष्कार करना लेखक के अधिकार में नहीं था. शब्दों की अपनी सत्ता ही उसे चुनौती देने को काफी था. Yeah, sorry, this was the other quote. रंगों की तरह ही शब्दों के सजीव मुखड़े और रंग हैं. अपने अर्थ, so it's like the words are active here. अपने मुखड़ों में से अपने अर्थ पहचानते हैं, वे उन्हें चित्रित करते हैं. Okay, this was the quote that I had. शब्दों की विचार क्रियाएं अपनी भाषाई सत्ता में मानवीय अभिव्यक्ति की ओर अग्रसर होती हैं. So you can see that for the writer, really words are, very, very active. We can also recognize this compression of history, craft, color, and sound. Painting, music, and weaving are among the metaphors Sobti uses most in regard to language in her description of material objects, like the one that opens, yes, Dilodan, sorry. So here, for example, in a passage in her dialogue with Krishna Baldev, she says, you can't say this is Urdu, this is Hindi, this is the language of Delhi. And in fact, this particular मुहावरा एक चवन्नी जयराम की जी की एक चवन्नी अदब अर्ज, क्या इस वाक्य में कुछ भी नया है ऐसे जो हिंदी के बाहर हो. Yeah, and this is the beginning of Dilodanish, where you have the Razaya, the Dulaya, the Nihalia, you have the Sartani Chint, you have the Laheria, you have the Chapa. So all words that have that really compress history, craft, color, and sound. And I'm getting towards the end. So famously, Sobti talk of herself as a combination of Shehrati bourgeois culture and Dehati Punjabi culture. Equally at ease in Shimla, or on Shimla's parade, or in Delhi's cafes, and in her ancestral Haveli in Gujarat, Punjab, bathing in the river, riding horses, and exchanging city songs and village stories with the other children. Her precise and vivid descriptions of material life in the village Haveli and the father's house in Sialkot in Channa, or of the old Delhi Haveli and Farash Khana in Dilodanish, show that from a young age she must have had eyes, her eyes had ears and her ears had eyes, and how really she did amass a world of words and voices. To this she added the office culture and lingo when she was a working woman, as in Yaron ke Yar, and the Delhi literary banter as Hashmat, her male doppelganger in Ham Hashmat. Mitti and Desh are two terms Sobti uses to evoke a specific location, a material world, and an intangible culture, and the way they are embodied in her as an individual and as part of a virasat. This is why, as we have seen, she was so against translating the rough idiolect and of thick village Boli of her characters into contemporary sophisticated expressions, Samkalin su Sanskrit Muhavre. And interestingly, I don't know if I have a, yeah, Sobti uses bhasha both for language, for idiolect, and when she comes to talk of Boli speech, she also calls them bhasha, Deshi bhasha, and Bolis, and so on. So, to come to my conclusion, Sobti's language is already clearly immersed in the ineluctable disunity and formal multiplicity, the necessary condition for having any language at all, as Holquist would say. Systemic multiplicity is indeed at the heart of her language. But for Sobti, and I'm coming to the end, this multiplicity and openness are, or should be, very much part of Hindi as a democratic language, and as a truly national language, or at least as the language not only of the Hindi Pradesh or of the Hindi elite. Hindi mat prabhudvar ki bhasha nahi hai, ki जनसाधारण की जबान से भ्रष्ट होती हो. हिंदी की खूबी उसके लोक भाषा होने में है कि वह अभिजाल की ओढ़ी हुई गरिमा में नहीं. अगर हिंदी किसी प्रदेश विशेष या धर्म वर्ग की भाषा नहीं, तो उसे अपने संस्कार को विस्तृत और व्यापक करना होगा. And in fact, interestingly, she sort of praises Indian English writing and Indian English for not just giving, for having been more accommodated to words from the life words of, of characters, of their characters. In fact, she says, देशी भाषाओं का देसी ध्वनि संसार अंग्रेजी में प्रकाशित रचनाओं में मौजूद है, मात्र शब्दों के रूप में ही नहीं, सांस्कृतिक संस्कार की मौन और मुखर विशेषताओं के साथ भी. So, अंग्रेजी जैसी भाषा ने जिसके पास शब्दों का विपुल भंडार है, हमारे देशज शब्दों का बहिष्कार नहीं किया. हमारे भाषाई शुद्धतावादी इस पर गंभीरता से विचार करें तो विभिन्न क्षेत्रीय भाषाएं और बोलियों से शब्द संपदा का आदान प्रदान हमारी राष्ट्रीय भाषा को भरपूर that was my mistake in typing संपन्न करेगा. देसी भाषाएं और बोलियां अपनी अभिव्यक्ति में कमतर नहीं है, वो एक लोकतंत्र का महत्वपूर्ण हिस्सा है. So in the context of the history of Hindi, in the decades after independence, when Sobti started to write and to be published, but also now, this acquires a critical edge. So whereas the language debates before 1947, as we know, concerned the dichotomization of Hindi and Urdu and the opposition between English and Hindi's claim to be the national language, the context of post-1947 was one of fear of fragmentation and of the legitimacy of Urdu in India as the language of Pakistan. So Manak Hindi becomes the key word in relation to the Bolis. And Manak Hindi also becomes a standard Hindi, the language of Hindi literature, as in the Nai Kahani. And in fact, as I've argued elsewhere, though the 1950s is of course also the period when Renu and Fanishwanath Renu and other writers do very creatively on the heteroglossic world of North India, their writings got called Anchalik or regional. This critical term is telling because it rendered the preference for heteroglossia marginal or appropriate only for regionalist or distant rural settings, not for mainstream oral modern literature. Anchalik heteroglossia was discussed as a mimetic strategy or as a sign of playfulness, which of course it is, but not only, not as an ideological position vis-a-vis language, writing, and the idea of the nation. So Krishna Sobti's reflections on language, her relationship with language and her use of it or by it instead, show what choosing heteroglossic vernacular entails. Memory banks, listening and hearing for voices, waiting for voices, acknowledging the power of words, their ruh, their poshak, their gharane, the very proactive ways in which she talks about the vechari kriyaen or words. All these are useful terms that give us a critical language to understand heteroglossic vernacular writing within a multilingual context. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Orsini, for this very erudite talk in which you use the case study of Krishna Sobti's use of language to argue a case in favor of multilingualism as opposed to a vernacular. You gave examples of a proliferation of linguistic codes and collapse of language boundaries in common speech of her characters and her own speech to suggest that perhaps multiculturalism is what defines the linguistic scenario here in India. Of course, these are positions which are open to debate. So I will pass it on to the rapporteurs to take up questions from the chat box because I can see there are quite a few questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for the enticing talk. It was a pleasure listening to you. We have a lot of questions. We'll take the first one. Do you perceive multilingualism as an alternative to vernacularism?
I think so. I mean, and I think so as I said, for me, it's important to think in a way, not to set them as, opposites. But in fact, what I learned from Krishna Sobti is the idea that, vernacular or any language is, of course, constituted by many languages and should be open to them rather than, reinforcing boundaries. And this is because there are many languages around. So in a way, it's not an either or, but and of course, I've been working on English recently, and that's another very obvious kind of, where there's a heteroglossia because there are different languages around. yeah, and as I say, I mean, I do see, although of course, as I say, vernacular is sort of tends to take this kind of, subaltern, strength vis-a-vis, English or other cosmopolitan languages, then often, you see the same vernacular actually then reinforcing exclusions and hierarchies of its own. So, that's why vernacular for me is a slippery term.
Professor Hans Harder has a question on the same line, that multilingualism doesn't qualify the relation between languages, whereas vernacularity does. Doesn't multilingual create a false harmony between equals, which actually doesn't exist in the social field? Isn't the provocation inbuilt into vernacular productive in teasing out the social position of a particular language?
No, to be honest, I mean, I'm always puzzled. I mean, I can see the where historically and politically is coming from, but I'm always puzzled that even so ideas of mixing or multiple always for some people suggest an equality. For me, they don't suggest equality at all. I never see culture or languages or as a realm of equality. I mean, where there's never equality, or hardly ever equality anywhere. Multiplicity doesn't mean equality. It's the same as with the Ganga Jamani Sanskriti. It's like, or Tehzeeb, because there's more than one, then it must be harmonious or equal. I don't think that's true at all. But vernacular, as I say, to me is, I mean, I can see, that's why I pointed to Stefan Helgesson project, because clearly he takes vernacular in a very different way from me. So in a way, again, rather than vernacularity per se, I find then, this heteroglossic vernacularity of Krishna Sobti more interesting, because, it already signals to the heterogeneity, and of course, I mean, heterogeneity means inequality, relationships of power, and all that, which are part of our social life. I mean, our social life is not equal, so why should our language relations be equal?
Thank you.
Maybe we can move on to Dr. Ravikant's question, which says, thanks, Francesca, for highlighting the linguistic genius of Sobti. You want to say something on muhavra used by her in plenty? I found a few in every para of Dilo Danish.
Right. So, to be honest, I mean, although I had supervised, I mean, I was one of the supervisors of Rosina's thesis. I mean, going back to Krishna Sobti's essays and to her thesis for this talk, I mean, that's when I was really struck by, the primacy, I never know how to say, of voices and hearing, and, so language as embodied in, an oral component. And muhavra, I suppose, are part of it, aren't they? They are the way in which kind of social language is, comes to live in your own idiolect and individual language. So I don't think I have sort of things to add to what Ravikant noticed, but I think that's part of. But I think that Jairam Ekchavani Jairam ji ki Ekchavani Adab Arz. I mean, the point she was making with Krishna Baldev Ved was that, again, Krishna Baldev Ved was trying to say, oh, but you've got a lot of Urdu in there. It's as if, this is some kind of addition, or this is some, and she's saying, well, actually, that was the language of that place, that was there from the start. Because I think, again, it's this sort of outsider view that says, oh, multilingualism is made of this language plus that language plus that language. But if you live language as an embodied, as a kind of part of what you hear in a particular space, then you will hear all these voices, this sort of muhavre and so on.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another question. How does the take on the subject differ in the first and second part of your talk? The strong subject in multilingualism and the porous subject in the second part, where the words take over agency. Can words have an agency in multilingualism, deciding on the language used?
So I think I have to let me see if I understand that. Take of the subject differ from the first and second part, the strong subject in multilingualism. I'm not sure, is there a strong subject in multilingualism? I'm not sure that I would say that there's, multilingual, I mean, it's I suppose as Professor Zaidi said at the beginning, multilingualism in, well, in somewhere like London, certainly, but also, my argument is that, show me a part of the world which is not multilingual to some extent, and certainly, in Delhi or in India, it's multilingual is a fact of life, isn't it? The idea that that there are different, and okay, you can take it from the, so that's it. I think it's a question of optics. If you take it from the point of view of the dynamic of speech, then you can say, okay, this is interlanguaging. But you also know that for the person, there is something called English, and there is something called Hindi, and there is something called Bhojpuri. So interlanguaging for me on its own doesn't quite cover that range that says there are separate languages, but then in their use they get mixed up. And I think again, so I done this sort of historical study of literary history in Eastern UP in the last 4 or 5 centuries, and you could say that for such a highly multilingual region, you would have expected many more text in mixed languages. But actually, there has been quite a strict protocol for the most part that says if you write in Persian, you write in Persian. You don't mix. If you write, and as we know, Urdu critics were, very exercised about what kind of words can you use in a ghazal, what are proper words, what are not proper words. So, there is the mixing, but there are also activities of, boundary making, border making, keeping of protocols. And in a way, I think we should be attentive to both, not just say, oh, everything should be mixed or everything. After all, if you see the language in which Krishna Sobti writes her essays, it's a very, Sanskritized and, particular kind of language. It's not a mixed language there. So I think, again, rather than saying, oh, it should be mixed all the time, I think we should have that kind of space and allow for recognize and pay attention to both the following or quite strict protocols, as well as the instances of and dynamics of mixing.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a question by Professor Margaret Prenu. Now we have a question by Professor Nishat Zaidi. If language is a carrier of worldview of a language-speaking community, how can we reconcile the absence of any term closer to the term vernacular with the usage of this term to describe the language situation in India?
Well, I think, as you know, historically, the term for vernacular was bhaka, no? Bhaka or bhasha, just language, no? Wasn't it? No? So, and I think, again, this is was part of another conversation sometime a few days ago. What do we do? Do we get stuck in a kind of mindset that says, oh, that concept is missing in that culture, or this is historically missing, or do we try to see, okay, how do people in this culture describe certain practices or certain use, or was there that process or that phenomenon, even if there wasn't a name for it? But to be honest, I still stand by David Lelyveld's, definition that people did not have languages. They wouldn't say this is my language and that's their language. They had linguistic repertoires which they varied according to domain of use and relationship. And I think that is still the case. After all, if we start taking into account accent, I mean, you even in English, you speak a different English with your friends and with your teacher, and when you are in an office and when you are, on the street. So, there's much more to language performance than this moniker of, vernacular or high language or so on, isn't there?
Thank you. We have one question by Albina. Thank you for referring to Hallquist's discussion of Bakhtin to bring Sobti's language to life. To the extent that languages are repositories of culture and history, both personal and collective. Would you say that Sobti was truly unique in her usage of language in her times, or is her language similar to many others?
No, I don't. I mean, I think. I think she was, I think she was one of the best writers in Hindi. So, to that extent, she was unique. But I think, interestingly, she herself points to Renu several times to make this point that, that writer, and of course there are other, other works, if not other writers who are as interested in the nuances of languages as they are. But I think it is true, and I think that is, if I look at, I've been looking at magazines of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and more recently, I think it is true that, and interestingly, for example, in translations, when there were foreign stories translated into Hindi, the language was inevitably very kind of manak and very unsubtle and unsupple. So, and to me, this kind of sort of thinking of that sort of somehow language heterogeneity was, Anchalik. It had to do with the specificity of some region, rather than say, okay, can you be Anchalik in Delhi? Can you be Anchalik in, in a city? Well, of course you can. But you have to be, so you have to sort of creatively, again, it's not just about mimesis, but find creative ways of expressing and highlighting that heteroglossia. Yeah. Joshi, Raza, absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. Time is up. I'll hand it over to the chair so we can wrap up the session.
Thank you. Thank you to you all.
Thank you, Professor Orsini and Professor Majeed, who just left, for these two wonderful talks. And we have a lot to think about, a lot to ponder, a lot to deliberate and calibrate as far as vernacular or multilingual situation in India is concerned. As they say, ghat ghat par badle pani, kos par bani. It's a highly complex situation as far as language is concerned. We have in South Asia. So obviously, we will not have easy solutions. We will not have, a single position which we all can agree to. So thank you so much once again. And you brought in Krishna Sobti, who is one of the favorite writers to most of us. So thank you so much. I think we come to an end of this session, right?
Yes, Professor Zaidi. Thank you, Professor Zaidi. Now we move on to a next session, that is paper presentation, starts from 4:20 p.m. to 5:35 p.m. IST. I hope all the presenters are ready with their presentations, and Indrani Das Gupta is the rapporteur along with Nida Iqbal. So I hand it over to them. Please take over.
Yeah, hello everyone. I think I should chair this session. My name is Jürgen Schaffers from Freie University in Berlin, and I'm very excited that we have
our rapporteurs are here. First to introduce you. They want to introduce you officially, but for everyone. So please let them do the honor.
Yeah, thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you, sir. So good evening, everyone, to session 3 of Language Ideologies and the Vernacular in South Asian Colonial and Post-Colonial Literatures and Public Spheres. So this is a paper presentation round. The chair for this session is Dr. Jürgen Schafflechner, who is a research group leader at the Department for Social and Cultural Anthropology, Freie Universität Berlin. He and his team study the political and social movements of religious minorities in South Asia in the advent of social media and communicative capitalism. Dr. Jürgen's research and teaching cover cultural and post-colonial theory, the religious and ethnic minorities in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the socio-anthropology of martial arts, and the role of documentary film in ethnographic research. His books include Hinglaj Devi, Identity, Change, and Solidification at a Hindu Temple in Pakistan, published by OUP, Ritual Journeys by Rutledge, co-edited with Christoph Bergman, and Alternative Imaginings of the Nation State, published by OUP and co-edited by with Aisha Asif and Christina Osterheld in collaboration with Max Kramer. Dr. Jürgen is the editor-in-chief of the journal Dastavezi, the audiovisual South Asia journal. Dastavezi is an international peer-reviewed open access e-journal which seeks to reposition film as a central mode of knowing and thinking about South Asia. Dr. Jürgen has also filmed, edited, and produced 6 documentary films on topics such as the alleged forced conversion of Hindu women to Islam in Sindh, the life worlds of Pakistani Hindu refugees in India, and the sacrificer rites amongst the Deva Pujak Wagri community in Karachi. His latest film, The Toxic Rains of Resentment, which was released in 2019, deals with the culture of resentment in today's politics. The film features interviews with Wendy Brown, Rahel Jaggi, and Peter Sloterdijk, among others. Dr. Jürgen has visiting appointments at several universities, including Harvard, Princeton, and Hebrew University. Welcome, sir, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think now I'm on. Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm very happy that I can be here and that we are going into a session which is, I think, also a little bit difficult than what we had, different than what we had before, because we're going to look a little bit also into the more digital, so where languages have moved over the last many decades, and particularly on social media, let's say over the last 2 decades. So the sessions are now a little bit shorter, so I don't want to take too much time. So I asked the speakers to stick to 15 minutes. I'm going to take the time, and then we have 10 minutes of Q&A afterwards. So the first paper is, as far as I'm informed, going to be co-authored by 2 authors whom we have here. Both of them are here, excellent. So the first one is Dr. Laila Mascarenas, who has been working as a visiting faculty of BITS Pilani KK Birla at Goa campus, and later was an assistant professor at the College of Law in Panjim. Her doctoral research was on children's literature, and she still continues to work on research on this topic. On top of this, she also writes her own short fiction and poetry. Her co-author, Frédéric Noronha, has been a journalist and a publisher of books and an online networker, and I think we can congratulate him because apparently in 2021, so very recently, he has completed his doctoral thesis, which is related to 20th century publishing in Goa. So both of them are going to present on language ideologies of a Goan desk calendar. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good evening, fellow researchers and scholars. Our paper today is on the language ideologies of a Goan desk calendar. Now, Konkani, which is the language of Goa, the official language, is perhaps the only living Indian language that is written in 5 scripts: Devanagari, Kannada, Roman, Malayalam, and Perso-Arabic script. The Devanagari script is the only officially accepted script in Goa since 1987. The long used and earlier widely published Roman or Romi script is still widely used for religious and secular literature by the Roman Catholic population. And the actively used Kannada script is especially popular in Karnataka. The Malayalam script has been used by the Konkani-speaking communities in Kerala, and the Perso-Arabic script is used by pockets along the Karnataka coast, particularly by the minority Muslim community. Seen as a tourist destination for much of India, Goa has a rather unusual history. Since the Portuguese conquered parts of the territory way back as 1510, it remained a Portuguese territory for among the largest length of any colony worldwide. For 451 years till 1961. During the Portuguese rule, Goa got one of the first medical colleges in Asia and was home to the first Gutenberg-style printing press in Asia. The Portuguese have been alternatively blamed for destroying the Konkani language and also for creating some of the first grammars and dictionaries in that language. Now I discuss the product, the calendar, the compiler, and the illustrations. The Wit and Wisdom of Ancient Goa is a quaint little desk calendar with 366 Konkani proverbs and aphorisms, compiled and published in 2011 by an engineer turned literature, Jose Lorenz, under the imprint Amazing Goa Publications. The calendar features only the month and date without any week or year, and thus can be reused every year. Lorenz explains how he conceptualized the desk calendar. I had seen similar calendars with inspirational quotes in English, so I thought of publishing our own Konkani proverbs to keep them in public memory and so that people may continue to use them in daily life. Because it's a desk calendar where a page is turned every day, by default a reader learns a proverb every day, and his or her day is lightened and inspired. A book would have remained on the shelf and would have been rarely opened and read, unquote. The calendar has been reprinted once, and a total of 2,000 copies of the product have been sold so far. It was very difficult to source a hard copy of the calendar for this study, as bookshops have sold out all their stocks. Now, this deceptively simple calendar has 2 languages on each page. The vernacular Konkani proverb with the direct English translation of the proverb, as well as the idiomatic meaning explained in English. Moreover, 2 scripts appear on the calendar's page for the Konkani idioms, the Devanagari script and the Roman script. Historically, the Romi script has been largely used to record the dialects of Roman Catholic Konkani speakers, while the Devanagari script has recorded that of Hindu Konkani speakers. Lawrence, of Roman Catholic background, has been supportive of the current initiatives which promote Devanagari rather than the Romi script, which is a more widely known and used by the Catholic community. We can gain a glimpse of an ideological reason for the 2 language scripts that appear on the pages of the calendar. Lawrence has been the vice president of the Goa government-run Goa Konkani Academy, or GKA. The GKA was established by the Congress government in 1986 during the heat of the Konkani versus Marathi language dispute in Goa in 1986. The GKA aims to bring about a speedy development of Konkani language, literature, and culture, and for promoting the cultural unity of Goa as a whole through the medium of Konkani language and literature. Now, the GKA, following the government official policy of granting status only to the Devanagari script, has largely supported the Devanagari script, though it has opened a limited space for writing in still widely used Roman script in recent times. Lawrence argues, I think the Devanagari script is good for easy and clear expression of the phonetics of the Konkani language. At the same time, the Roman script has the advantage of being nearly the universal mode for internet search and data and social media. So the Roman script should be used to spread the use of Konkani via web pages, e-zines, chats, social magazines, etc. Interestingly, we can see that the calendar can not only be read by people familiar with either of the 2 Konkani scripts, but also with a person familiar with only English. In addition to the 2 languages and scripts, the calendar is visually appealing because of the cartoon illustrations by the famous Mario Miranda. Cartooning has its own language. As Sakona explains, meaning and humor are produced via either 2 semiotic modes, the verbal and the visual, or solely via the visual mode. An online store, artzolo.com, praises Mario's brilliant depictions of Goa and the way his satire captures everyday moments and humorous encounters in his cartoons. Mario's cartoons have a variety of characters in different situations and places. They're easily recognizable to any person familiar with the culture of Goa. His humor is based on the portrayal of easily recognizable types and stereotypes. Now, his cartoons have been an ubiquitous phenomenon in Goa and Mumbai for decades. In newspapers and magazines, the Current, Illustrated Weekly of India, Midday, the Economic Times, the Afternoon Dispatch and Courier, and in public spaces such as murals and decorative artworks. Merchandise like t-shirts, mugs, decorative tiles are easily available in the big Mario gallery stores. So his cartoons are easily recognizable because of popularity. However, though the calendar features illustrations by Mario Miranda, Miranda did not do any illustrations specifically for the calendar. Instead, Lawrence met Miranda and obtained his permission to use select images from his cartoons and paid him a small fee for the same. This tidbit of information is useful when studying the product because it reveals that the available artwork must have influenced the choice of proverbs selected for the calendar. Rather than art illustrating the text, only those texts were selected that could be illustrated with appropriate cartoons. This explains why some of the illustrations are not an exact match of the underlying thought of the proverbs. Let's go on to language ideologies. We use the term language ideologies in the same way that Farr and Song use it. Citing Catherine Woolard, they say representations, whether explicit or implicit, that construe the intersection of language and human beings in a social world are what we mean by language ideology. Therefore, language ideologies connect the linguistic with the social. Alfred Braganza tells us that Konkani proverbs are crystals of a lifelong experience of the Goan people. They hold the mirror up to Goan nature and tradition. They reveal the economic, social, religious, and political fabric of the traditions of yesteryears. In this paper, we have attempted to locate the Konkani proverbs in their complex matrices of social, economic, and linguistic practices. Due to the language ideologies of upper classes that rejected the use of Konkani and preferred to use written Portuguese or Marathi in Goa, or Kannada and Marathi in neighboring regions of the Konkan, the extant proverbs that are recorded and highlighted by the desk calendar could be considered the proverbs of the common folk. These proverbs do not focus on the life and concerns of the rich upper classes, and thus we get a peek into the world of the lower class people as a result of the privileging of the Konkani language by the latter. S.S. Talmaki explains that proverbs contain wit and wisdom based on illustration of daily incidents. Therefore, it's important to note whose daily life is being reflected in the proverbs. Talmaki makes a pertinent sociological observation about the dearth of literature in Konkani written by the Saraswats, a Goan Hindu upper caste, while emphasizing the contribution of Konkani-speaking Christians to the growth of the language. However, it was not the Christian elites who were the saviors of the Konkani language. Jason Keith Fernandez observes that Catholic elite use Portuguese as its public and oftentimes intimate language, while the Hindu upper caste elites use Marathi as a public language, so much so that Konkani was identified as the language of the criados, servants, in this case being the Catholic underclass of the territory. Spoken Konkani was thus associated with the Catholic laboring classes. This intersection of language and human beings in a social context reveals the language ideologies of the use of the Konkani language. The wit and wisdom of the proverbs that we find are a collation of the daily experiences of the largely working class culture. Therefore, we are able to explore the cultural spaces occupied by the non-elites. If the proverbs use idioms and motifs from agriculture and fishing, it's because of Goan economy was heavily dependent on rice farming, coconut plantation, livestock, and fishing in the past. Apart from figuring out what were the common professions, we can also glean social attitudes towards women from the proverbs. Gracias undertakes a historical study of the condition of women in Goa, and she says that the boy was always profitable to parents because he stayed with the parents, he looked after them, while a girl would go off and get married and go off to her in-laws' homes. Hence, the boy is compared to a coconut tree and the girl to a plantain tree. The proverb Chero Maravori, Cheru Kelivori. The boy is like a coconut tree and the girl is like a plantain tree, can be interpreted in the light of the above sociological situation. Another proverb that comments unfavorably on the value of a woman is Gor Askor Bail Makor. When a house is in disrepair and the wife is ugly like a monkey, a man needs no leash or has no fear of losing either. Here, the wife who's not good looking is considered worthless and a wretched possession not worthy of being cherished and protected. We have used the textual analysis of the proverb presented in the text calendar as a springboard to present a few insights into the history, sociology, and culture of Goa's past. But when we refer to Goa's past, this past is of an indeterminate timeline, roughly stretching back some 4 or 5 centuries. We have not tried to trace the exact origins of the proverbs, but simply use the text as it is printed on the page of the calendar. This paper has a short textual analysis, a brief overview of the history of the Konkani language, and the prevalence of English as a language of social mobility. Textual analysis of the Konkani proverbs. Edward de Leva explains that the Konkani proverbs gives valuable information of the social, political, economic, and religious life of Goa of yesteryears. Petty kings, Catholic priests, landlords, and rich businessmen wielded power of the common man. As the epigrams being discussed in this paper were in circulation mostly among the latter, there's an embedded critique of the hierarchy in these proverbs. Take, for example, Maharaj Zalo Ambil Viswanlo. When he became a king, he forgot the days of gruel. Or Padritso Sarma Woniet Noin. The priest's sermon is not applicable to his sister-in-law. These are thinly veiled criticisms of the hypocrisy of the ones in power. While Batkarache Vare, Batak Sare, the landlord's fart is manure for the fields, could be interpreted as a tongue-in-cheek praise of a landlord's fart, which the poor peasant had to just bear whatever he said and whatever he did. The occupations of the common man are mentioned in the Proverbs.
Just really quickly, sorry, we are about to run out of time. You have 2 more minutes. Could you wrap up your argument, please?
Okay, I'll just read one proverb to just tell you about fishing. Kasti bizle bagod nuste doru nozo. You cannot catch fish without getting a loincloth wet. Okay, let's go straight to the story of Konkani. Language has been politicized over the decades. There was fights between which would be the official language, Marathi or Konkani. Finally, we have Konkani that became the official language. And the language of recent times has a lot of politics in it. Let us just see English versus Konkani. Konkani speaking can evoke shame in the presence of English-speaking persons. So there was a boy who was traveling on a public bus, happily talking in boys were talking in Konkani, but when a girl got into the bus, they switched to English to impress her. So speaking English is considered a marker of being educated. So it's an embarrassment to the youth if you speak in Konkani in some areas. So English is seen as a ticket towards upward social mobility. So we are at a crossroad and only time will tell whether English will wipe out the beauty of Konkani. And the script issue is a complex one, and at play we see Konkani in the Romi script is not given official sanction even in job interviews. Only the Devanagari script is important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just 2 very, very brief observations. I know that Indrani already is probably waiting. I think what is very interesting here is that we see with the calendar that ideology somehow oozes from a lot of strange positions, we might even say, right? A lot of very benign items in society. And what I found particularly interesting also for the workshop is that it seems like that language ideology very often does not need words or semantics. Language ideology can also be done without actually using language in terms of written language, right? And I think that's a very curious observation that you made. Sorry, Indrani, I'm giving over to you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful paper. So we have a few questions here. Professor Hans Harder has a question. Do you know of any social situations in which all 5 scripts, Malayalam, Kannada, Roman, Nastaliq, Nagari for Konkani, come together, or do they fall into entirely discrete spheres?
I would like Frederick to answer this. Frederick?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, actually, the different scripts are used at different varying levels nowadays. We were surprised to find that there is a journal coming out from coastal Karnataka which still uses the Perso-Arabic script. Malayalam is on the decline. Kannada is widely used, Romi is widely used, Devanagari is officially supported, but I'm not sure whether they come together in the same place.
Okay, there's another question. I think it's so by Kashish. Where can we find some of the images included in this calendar? Also, are these Konkani proverbs visible in other popular media? Now that the Goan desk calendar has brought back these erstwhile rejected proverbs, what kind of demographic do we see buying and using this calendar?
There is a lot of interest in the whole Goan identity across the Goan diaspora. And the compiler himself is going to come out with a new edition with new proverbs. He says he's going to put it up on Amazon by April. And it's such a popular calendar that was sold out. I just had to beg, borrow, and steal to get a copy to do this thing. You don't really get this particular calendar in soft copy. It would be left to the compiler to be able to upload it because it's copyrighted.
Okay, there's a question by Meenakshi that if it would be nice if you could elaborate on the visual and symbolic representation on these calendars.
Okay, now the Mario Miranda images, as I said, are not an exact exact match rather, because they were just taken from stock images of Mario Miranda. But for example, you'll have the flower seller with a basket on her head, or you will have the toddy tapper climbing the tree, and the proverb saying that don't stop halfway when you climb the coconut tree. So images that are so familiar to anyone living in Goa. You see toddy tappers, you see fishing people, and apart from the fact that Miranda's cartoons are like so popular that you see them everywhere.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for this wonderful presentation. Over to you, Dr. Yogin.
Whoops, there we go. Thank you so much. So the next paper is by Meenakshi Yadav, whom I'm sure many of us have seen already, who is a senior research fellow and is pursuing her PhD from the Center of English Study at GNU. So she specializes in digital cultural studies, which I found personally very, very interesting, and particularly focuses on user-generated content. So her paper has the title From English to Hinglish to Indic, a reflection on the evolution of digital folk video cultures in India and the YouTube versus TikTok controversy. I'm very excited to hear.
Hello, thank you, sir. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay.
You're audible.
Also, I'm the other Meenakshi, so you might have not seen me before. Okay. So I'll get right into my paper. For the first decade and a half, Internet India was a niche privilege, and it was a young, affluent, metro-dwelling, English-speaking, predominantly male digital native section of the Indian population, which populated it at the time when democratization in expressing and broadcasting oneself was waning on the internet in India, with the coming of the participative infrastructure of the Web 2.0 technologies and platforms, including the user-generated content, UGC, on social media sites like Orkut, YouTube, Facebook, blogs, Twitter, etc. This also coincided with the rolling out of the 3G and VWA spectrum networks in the country during the early 2010s, which was a major development as it led to the beginning of the proliferation of wireless internet access in the country. This was a very significant development as it led to the expansion and the relatively high growth of the internet at the beginning of this decade in urban areas of the country, which enabled a sizable chunk of the affluent sections of the urban population to come online. English was the exclusive language of accessing it at the time, and only less than 10% of the Indian population are conversant in English, which further added to its exclusionary character. roughly the period between roughly the period beginning in 2013 and lasting around 2015, 2016 can be described as the English phase of the internet in India. During this time, the very narrow privileged demography described above were colloquially referred to as the Twitter class in India. Were the ones.
Excuse me, Meenakshi.
Meenakshi,
Yeah?
could you slow down a little bit, please? It's
Okay.
difficult to hear you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so during this time, the very narrow privileged demography described above, who are colloquially referred to as the student class in India, were the ones whose culture, preoccupations, and ethos dominated the internet in India. This was the first demography on the internet that was involved in expressing and broadcasting themselves online through UGC, like videos, memes, blogs, etc. It is with the UGC created by this digital native section of the Indian population for the consumption of others like them and hosted and circulated on social media platforms through their peer networks that internet folk culture, that is culture formed on internet through practices popularized by ordinary people in general, and the digital folk culture in particular in India began. This demography has the first mover advantage in this space, and it was their expressions, representations, preoccupations, and ethos that became the dominant and normative expressions, representations, preoccupations, and ethos of the internet in India at the time and for the coming few years. The original UGC mostly, the original video UGC mostly in the comedy and entertainment genre began to get created and consumed widely on the internet at the time, mostly on YouTube. There was a great uptake in this kind of content, and in a short span of time, these videos on YouTube became quite popular and influential among the urban youth, especially the guys. The YouTube channel called The Viral Fever or TVF was the first channel on YouTube in India which created original entertainment content exclusively for the web. Its early content was dominated by its hugely popular parody videos, which parodied the mainstream media content in India. There was a very noticeable critical and liberal streak in the content that was created at this time, and this content situated itself in sharp contradistinction to the content that dominated the traditional popular media of television in Bollywood. The content was very alternative in character and was created for people who shared this sensibility and who did not enjoy the kind of content that was dished out by the traditional mass media. The other very influential comedy collective that dominated the internet at the time was AIB. AIB, in a certain way, started and led the cultural capital-driven phase of focusing heavily on content that is regarded as politically correct and politically progressive. After the success and huge virality of their It's Your Fault video, many creators, including AIB itself, deliberately began to create more such politically correct and politically progressive videos. This kind of content spread rapidly because people shared it widely over their social media networks. They did this because they wanted to associate with this kind of content, which to a great extent has to do with the entire social media self-fashioning spirit and this affluent section of the spirit of this affluent section of the society. The kind of content was also instrumental in making the entertainment UGC on the internet reach beyond it and become part of the larger imagination as it generated a huge crossover effect into the mainstream media. The people, audiences that this internet was relegated to at this time is the main factor in enabling this crossover into the mainstream media. Most users involved in this form of entertainment and medium at the time were tech-savvy, middle to upper middle class, elite of the society, the netizens, who despite being a small minority in the country are the most vocal and empowered. The fact that the first movers on the internet in India who were creating, consume, and participating in the digital folk cultures at the time primarily came from that section of the larger Indian society, which has cultural capital and a very disproportionately high level of representation and influence in the larger traditional media scape and the public culture in India, led to two significant things. First, towards recognizing and reinforcing their fairly homogeneous culture, preoccupation, and ethos as the mainstream or normative culture, preoccupation, and ethos of the internet in India, and second, towards mainstreaming of the internet in India. This recognizing and reinforcing of their culture, preoccupation, and ethos happened as a normative on the internet was never challenged or contested by any corner. These contestations only began after a couple of years of the data revolution, to which we'll get in some time. The mainstreaming of the internet and internet culture in India happened at this time through the generation of cross-media effect. The most important interesting events occurring on the internet began to be picked up and commented on by the traditional media, which gave it mainstream visibility and legitimacy. This was the most remarkable contribution of the cultural capital-driven English UGC video phase of the larger internet culture in India. Coming to the second phase, the cutthroat competition among the telecom service providers and the internet service providers led to a significant decline in internet access rates in the second half of 2013. There was an 80 to 90% reduction in 3G data tariff. This, along with the fact that by this time, a lot of low-cost mobile devices and tablets capable of accessing the internet became available in the Indian handset market, led to the beginning of the spread of internet significantly outside of the metros. There was a considerable increase in the usage of the internet after this development, and there was an expansion in the user base as the internet began to spread rapidly in non-metro urban areas and among the lower socioeconomic sections. The demographic dominantly still comprised of the young male. These developments led to the transition from the dominance of the English phase to the dominance of the English phase of the digital folk video cultures in India. The expansion in the demography on the internet along the socio-economical, geographical, linguistic, or demographic lines began to give the internet culture in India a heterogeneous character. The period roughly between 2016 to 2018 can be characterized as the English phase. During this phase, the video UGC platform YouTube still dominated. The most popular UGC video content created at this time was in the Hindi language, but all the practices surrounding it were predominantly in English. The section of the population that the internet was confined to was still urban and had a basic level of proficiency in English, which enabled them to navigate the internet space and participate in the digital folk cultures at the time. It was still the middle class and the relatively well-off sections of the urban male youth that dominated the internet at this time. And therefore, it was those creators who came from and catered to this demographic on the internet who became very popular and influential now. The three most prominent names among them is of Bhuvan Bam, Amit Badana, and Ashish Chinchilani. They all came from this demography and were creating content for others like themselves. They were all creating content that others like themselves would find relatable and relevant. All these videos are in the Hindi language and contain themes like the school life, the love life, the college life, family life, romantic life, etc. of teen and young adult boys, which are dealt with in a funny and relatable manner. Bhuvan Bam was the first and arguably the most influential among these creators. The massive increase in the section of the population, which is predominantly young, male, lower middle to middle class, Hindi speaking from urban and semi-urban backgrounds, online can be seen in the spectacular rise in popularity of his YouTube channel called BB Minds, which was unprecedented in the history of YouTube in India. In 2017, he became one of the world's biggest content creators in terms of subscribers on YouTube. The other big creator to emerge at this time on the scene was Amit Badana, who also created relatable content in Hindi language. In 2018, he became one of India's biggest YouTube creators, and his video titled Bhai Behan Ki School Life was on the global number 9 on the YouTube top 10 list of the videos for the year 2018. They both made videos in Hindi, and it was the relatable Hindi language of everyday use, which was replete with slang and cuss words. All of this gave the language used and ethos expressed in their videos a relatable character, as this kind of language is part of the common parlance of their intended audience. Along with this, the nature of the content was remarkably different from the kind of content that had come before them, as it is seen to give articulation to those aspects of the Indian identity and lived experience in reality, which did not find an articulation anywhere previously in the mainstream media. Also, the humor contained in this video is very accessible. All these characteristics made the content extremely popular among the community and made these creators internet superstars in India in a very short span of time. The most remarkable thing about Bam or Badana and others like them is that despite the fact that their channel was bigger than AIB and TVF combined, as Bam and Badana had a bigger reach among the people, yet they did not have the kind of mainstream visibility that, say, an AIB video had. This is because their content does not generate the media crossover effect that the AIB type of content generates, because it does not have an elite engagement that is dealing with the issues and perspectives organized from the point of view of the elite of the society with cultural capital and social capital. The mainstream media, especially electronic, in India is still dominated by a very narrow section of the population, which predominantly comprises of the educated Hindu, middle to upper class, mostly urban and suburban, mostly North Indian, mostly male from the upper classes. And it does not see much value in the kind of content created by creators like Bam or Badana and enjoyed by their audiences. The significant thing that the above set of developments led to was a diversification in the dominant public culture in India. Different and diverse kinds of contents, personalities, and discourses were becoming a part of the public culture and consciousness in India, unlike ever before. The gaining visibility in the public culture by those who were previously underrepresented in the traditional media led to the usual issues which arise when heterogeneous, mutually incompatible, and sometimes oppositional values begin to coexist and compete for legitimacy, supremacy, and influence in the same space. Towards the end of this phase, India had already become the country with the second highest internet user base in the world. This led to India becoming one of the chief priorities and the center of attention of the internet ecosystem globally. They established American tech giants like Google, Facebook, etc. The emerging Chinese tech companies like ByteDance, like ByteDance, along with Indian apps like ShareChat, began to aggressively tailor their products to suit the diverse Indian market situation, consisting of the mobile first and mobile only, non-creme de la creme, digital immigrant sections of the Indian society who were Indic language speakers. Reliance Jio was launched in September 2016, which disrupted India's telecom industry. It provided the world's cheapest internet data at ₹50 per GB to Indians, which at the time cost around $250, which is very expensive when adjusted for per capita income in the country. This was a major milestone in the evolution of the internet in India, as it made data truly affordable and accessible for the vast majority of the country who belong to the lower middle class and below, and for the over 70% of the population of India that lives in semi-rural and rural areas. The adoption and usage of internet exploded in the country, and although there was an uptake of the internet across the board, but the growth was far more accelerated amongst those sections and in those regions which were previously heavily underrepresented on the internet in India.
There are two more minutes left. So could you wrap up your argument, please?
Okay, sir, I'll try to. Okay. So just the user persona of the Indian language speakers, Indian language users on the internet in India, which came online after the data revolution of 2016, do not have much in common with the user persona of the English internet users of India. Socioeconomical, geographical, linguistical, or demographically speaking, the digital immigrant section of the population that dominantly came online at this time were uneducated or undereducated, came from lower middle class and poorer section of the population who did not have any cultural heft or influence in the traditional media. They were relatively older, predominantly male. Okay. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up. The small minority of the population, that of caste Hindus of the country, have historically held most of the influential positions in all forms of public life in India, including in politics, media, business, academia, etc. And as a result, theirs has historically and in the present times been the hegemonic culture of India. This minority section of the larger population also forms a big part of the most economically well-off section of the Indian society, which has disposable income and to which the market forces and popular mass media in India dominantly caters to. These two factors have overlapped and led to a situation where only a very narrow demographic of the urban Hindi and or English speaking, predominantly North Indian upper to upper caste people getting dominantly represented in the popular mass media in India as the normative of India, and it is their culture, values, and ethos that get represented as the mainstream values, culture, etc. This dominant representation couldn't be farther from reality, as it excludes the vast majority of the country of over 85% of the population from it. Okay. The mass adoption and expansion of the internet led to two main developments. First, the internet acquiring a radical nature in the sense of becoming accessible to those who were in the media dark zones, that is, those who lived in areas of the country which were not penetrated by the modern media of mass communication and were not being catered to by any kind of traditional media in the country. The radical practices of self-representation and expression by those who were previously underrepresented, if not completely invisibilized by the dominant media in India through the unconventional short TikTok videos created by the subaltern and marginalized people in India, like those who lived in India's rural hinterlands, were uneducated, who worked as laborers and farmers, were housewives living in rural parts, are people belonging to the LGBTQI communities and belong to the poorer sections of the population. They came online and they came online.
We're really running out of time. Could you sum up maybe in, let's say, 30 seconds? Sorry.
Okay. Please give me just 1 minute. The jealousy and insecurity inspired by this development is at the heart of the allegation of TikTok content being cringe, that is leveled against its content and creator. It belonged to the communities traditionally marginalized and invisibilized in the traditional or even the new media in India by those belonging to the privileged sections of the society. The subaltern and marginal communities getting means of self-expression and representation and rubbing shoulders with the most privileged sections of the Indian society and breaking their exclusivity in content creation and representation is a prime source of the backlash against TikTok's success, and it underlay the calls to ban the app. That's the main argument.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi. Now I need to ask Indrani for guidance. Do we now have time for at least one question from the plenum, or do we need
sir,
to
I think so we can take up one question.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
We have 7 minutes.
Yes,
We have 7 minutes to go, I think, right now.
Yes.
So could we take up one question, Meenakshi?
Maybe 2. Let's see how she answers. Yeah.
Okay. So there's one question by the other Meenakshi. How do you address the perversion of language, be it any language, to elicit laughter on social media?
What do you mean by perversion of language? Like, I don't understand. What is perversion of language?
Sorry to intervene right away, but by perversion, I mean perversion like how these people make fun of English, to be very specific. They make fun of people who speak English, actors, actresses, or Instagram, public figures like Instagram, those who post recurrently on Instagram. So those who are very popular. So for instance, there are many, and they particularly, I have seen many videos where Badana make fun of these people, where they are making fun of all of them, that, you know, the way they are speaking, how they are carrying forward their argument. And sometimes in the process, they body shame them, and, you know, so
that might happen. So there are 2 things. You know, when you talk about perversion of language, you're assuming that there is like one right kind of language or an ideal kind of language, and the movement away from it or maybe playing with it is perversion. So firstly, I don't agree with that. And as far as making fun is concerned, that is true. Everybody is making fun of everyone. For example, even people, you know, who use the Hindi language or Indic languages, or when these people, you know, who speak English as a second language or third language. If you look at the content coming from that side, for example, Tanmay Bhatt has, you know, a YouTube video called On TikTok Cringe. Like, look at that. So it's not just like this section making fun of that section. It's like everybody making fun of everybody else. So it's less like, you know, it's less of peaceful coexistence. It's more like, you know, like living together separately. So everybody is living in their filter bubbles, but everybody is making fun of everyone who's not like them. So that is like an established practice on the internet.
Thank you, Meenakshi. We can take up another question. This is by Kashish. Has the unavailability of TikTok in India pushed the Indic digital space back to the one dominated by English?
The thing is, you know, many clones of TikTok have come, but none of them are as good as TikTok. So there are, you know, people are looking for a good platform. They're not finding it, but, you know, the search is still on. And the most important part is like TikTok used to cater to a vast majority of the country. The only trouble is that, you know, this part of the country is not really affluent. They don't have a lot of disposable income. So the companies, you know, like Facebook and, you know, ByteDance, they have to look for alternative monetization models. So one of the reasons, you know, why Facebook or Instagram or YouTube for that matter, monetization is easy because the sections that use them have the money. So if you can figure out how to monetize them, then like creating apps for this, for the, you know, the less affluent sections is not a problem. TikTok was a very good intuitive app. You didn't have to put any inputs on it. So it was good for people who are like uneducated or really low on education. So it was not just about English. It was also about like language as in the written form. People who did not know any written language could also like use this app because it was so intuitive. So once these issues are solved, you know, TikTok, another like, you know, the Indic space will move forward again. I mean, of course, it was like a bad break, sudden break, but I'm sure once other better apps come, this problem will be resolved, and the Indic space will like move forward because there's a lot of potential there. This is going to happen.
Okay, thank you, Meenakshi. There's another question. Can I take it up, Meenakshi?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's another question by Frederick, and he has asked, does imbalance of people online also reflect disparities within society? Can the online media offer alternative voices or only deepen divides?
I'm sorry, will you
repeat
the question because of the aeroplane? I couldn't hear it.
Yeah. Does the imbalance of people online also reflect the disparities within society? Can the online media offer alternative voices or only deepen divides?
That's a very good question. So there are a couple of things. Like, you know, if you look at internet's trajectory in India, the privileged classes, the fluent classes, people who had to, buy internet when it was expensive were the ones, using the internet, and it slowly percolated to, the lower sections, people who did not have as much economic, capacity. So if you look at internet space per se, of course, it like reflects that disparity. If you look at the internet, like for example, 5 years ago, if you looked at the internet in India, you would see that. Like, everybody in India is rich, because that's the kind of demographic that was present there. Say, 3 years ago or 4 years ago, if you saw, you would see like, the middle class, Hindi speaking, but people who knew enough English to navigate the internet present there. So if at that time you saw internet, you would feel that, okay, people in India are both affluent and also middle class. But after TikTok came, and after other, similar apps like ShareChat and ByteDance Hello came, then you would actually be able to see like, people who are actually the marginalized, people who work as laborers and farmers and, domestic help, and, people from the LGBT community, but who are not rich, like, not affluent, like the really poor people who have never had a representation anywhere. So TikTok, in that sense, like when TikTok was present, you could like see all of these sections on the internet. One of the reasons I feel TikTok got banned was because it belonged to these sections. For example, sometimes back, there was this entire child porn, like child soft porn kind of content on YouTube. When things like this happen on Facebook or YouTube or TikTok, there's always like, calls to police, to police these apps or to bring in policies to check these kind of contents. But when there was problematic content found on Twitter, the only call was to just ban the app. There is no talking. There is no conversation about freedom of speech. There is no conversation about, like educating the younger, users of the app. There's like an outright call for banning the app. And that was only, in my opinion, that was only possible because it's, it's the digital immigrant communities, the people who don't really have a lot of cultural capital and social heft in the country. Because every time something of this sort happens on Facebook or, on like Twitter and these platforms, there's always like, oh, these platforms need to be more responsible. But there's never a call to ban the platform because, again, there's a backlash, there's an outrage and freedom of speech and things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you. And sir, over to you. We can now move over to the third presenter.
All right. Just a quick question. Do we have 15 minutes or 20 minutes per paper?
15.
We have 15 minutes.
Right. Okay. All right. So then for the last part of our session, we have Rindam Saha, who is a research scholar in the Department of English at Qazi Nazrul University and formerly a research associate in the Indian Council of Social Sciences. He's now working on world literature and post-colonial literature. And his talk is titled Towards a Republic of Vernacular (brackets world letters) on how to planetarize world. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. So before presenting my paper, I would like to say a few words. First of all, thanks to the organizing team for giving me the opportunity to present my thought. And as I am an MPhil research scholar, I am right now in a nascent stage of my research. So I would love to welcome only a suggestion or any observation or comment which will help me to rethink my engagement with my research for the future. So let's start. So the title of my paper is Towards a Republic of Vernacular in bracket world letters on how to planetarize a world literature. So basically, this proposal builds on Pascal Casanova and Franco Moretti's intervention on reworlding existing templates of world literature, arguing how to broaden the geographic territoriality of world literature. So ending in that way, the current Anglophonic bias and hegemony in this field. In doing that, it takes on broad issues of inclusivity, ubiquity, modes of linguistic and ideological freedom, and equal representation of writings between the worlds. So this is, in other words, an attempt of deterritorialization and reterritorialization of world literature, actualizing in that process Casanova's idea of a world republic of letters. so which will be democratic and representational enough to deconstruct the anglicized monopoly of world letters. So the dominance of English alienates a large section of global population whose nomadology in planetary thinking and literary expression through their vernacular articulation requires a necessary recognition. So these nomad cells demand narrative plurality and linguistic democracy. So borrowing the ideas of contemporary scholars in this field like David Damrosch, Fencia, Boidi, Bhattacharya, who have argued for an alternative idea of world literature in their recent works, such as What is World Literature, What is a World, or Post-Colonial Writing in the Era of World Literature, Text, Territories, and Globalization. So this proposal offers a critique of the existing notion of world in world literature as exclusively Eurocentric. So following them, I argue for an idea of world making in the context of world literature, and I do that through my discussion of vernacular Indian text of Indian authors such as Rabindranath Tagore and Kazi Nazrul Islam on world literature to see how they offered an alternative concept of re-territorializing world literature. So I shall demonstrate how proper recognition and translation of regional literary text of different non-European and non-American countries can planetarize world literature, which is at present limited within its Anglophonic boundedness. So what I have planned actually, because of the paucity of time, I have sorted all the segments of my paper. Now I am going to my next segment, and that is the existing templates of world literature / anglicization of world literature. So literature by default is an identical figure seeking the reader's association to explore the regional narratives from the clumsy cells of provincialism. It connects people with their different histories, cultures, and ideas embedded in various forms of activities in different languages across the globe. So the ubiquitous nature of literature is very much associated with the progress of global capitalism. In the late 15th century, the prime motive in the countries like Italy, Holland, England was the circulation of money, and what Marx says, the universal equivalent to make a capitalist world system. And later that the concept of world literature came in existence with the notion of will to literature by Goethe, who asserts in 1827, I am, within quotes, I am more and more convinced that poetry is the universal possession of mankind, revealing itself everywhere and at all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. So to formulate the concept of world literature, he also conferred the national literature is now rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. So this method of reading has been critiqued and sometimes rejected. So in the 18th and 19th century, the idea of world literature has not been accepted. Rather, the national literature has been prioritized, and that, as for example, the British diplomats, Lord Chesterfield, clearly defined the term illiterate, meant someone who didn't know Latin and Greek. A few nations like England, France, and USA, and others with their national languages have ruled over the literature in terms of establishing the nationalization of literature. The nationalization has set an administrative process within the defined territory. And now I would emphasize on Pascal Casanova and Franco Moretti's view on world literature. Here, Casanova and Moretti actually engage, their scholarly engagement unearth the myriad issues which are being discussed across the world as a theoretical tool of world literature. Now, I'd like to focus on their perspectives, which are a challenging task for them. So Casanova, in her book, The World Republic of Letters, provides a suggestive literary method, and to establish her method, she sets an experimental opinion to examine various patterns, variations, repetitions in a single literary work across the literary domain. So while locating the patterns in a single literary work, a medium is being made to occupy the specific position in the world literary space. And it is the result of the continuous struggle in between the works of the margins and the centers, and in the process of exclusion as well as in inclusion. So to her, the templates of world literary space need to go against the conventional thoughts about literature to reconsider every notion and every category to find the patterns linking to the singular to the world in world literary space. So she proposes 4 methods or the patterns in terms of understanding the interconnection of the world republic of letters. All these are in my paper. I am going again. The next one, the Franco Moretti's concept, of the conjectures of world literature, and in this essay, he defines the world literature from mere world literature is differentiated from the mere literature because of the sheer enormity of task of the world literature. His main argument revolves around one particular point, and that is the world literature is not an object. It's a problem, and a problem that asks for a new critical method. So it is based on the Max Weber's article on objectivity in social science and social policy, where he wrote, it is not the actual interconnection of things, but the conceptual interconnection of problems which define the scope of the various sciences. A new science emerges where a new problem is pursued by a new method, and reading more and more and talking about the various languages is a good thing, but it is not the solution. So what would be the solution? That to find a method or solution, it is necessary to make a hypothesis. So several hypotheses he has raised in his essay. Now I would like, so there are the many hypotheses like the distance reading. Okay, so now I would emphasize on the vernacularization / recognition of nomadology in planetary thinking. And here I am focusing on the point of vernacularization, which is now considered as a method of democratization of various languages, which are gradually losing their worldliness because of their peripheral position, and the process of rewording those languages, especially the great unread, quote unquote, in the area of world literature is called vernacularization. And the term has an etymological source. But the current meaning of this term are, we can say, we can call the native, the ordinary, the local, or the desi. And these names have different connotations in their way, but there is a common ground, and that common ground is related to what Silvama called home-oriented. In my study, different Bengali vernacular texts are being included as a part of the research, and those local text language is neither Eurocentric nor internationally acclaimed, but the various and structure patterns are somehow proliferating the message of world making, disbordering the social culture, socio-cultural political contours across the universe. So now I would like to borrow the term of Spivaks. Spivaks in her book Death of a Discipline talks about the teleopoiesis to provoke the comparatives, how to imagine across the time and space with uncertain consequences. At the end of the book, she concerns an alternative idea of the global, namely the planetarity. By planetarity, she means that it's a seemingly a trivial semantic ploy masking a far-reaching ambition, namely the defamiliarization of globality and the globalization, and it evokes a set of values oriented towards responsibility rather than control. So she observes and recognizes the nomads in planetary thinking, and nomads are those outcasts who are the representative of colonized countries which are not allowed to imagine the notion of planetarity. So vernacularization and the nomad selves in planetary thinking are quite similar in terms of marginality. The study is trying to ground that argument based on these two methods, which are being cultivated to reimagine the world from a Republican point of view. Now I'm going to the alternative ideas of world literature, and here I am mentioning, the logic of worlding, which unearths the various templates which have engaged the optics of interpretation, rejecting the limited knowledge articulated centuries after centuries in the name of existing notion of world literature. And that's why I am choosing the book, What is World Literature? And that book is engaged with the alternative idea, where David Damrosch, actually a literary historian, a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at Harvard University, had defined the term, and by the term he means that all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. So Damrosch claims that the world is not infinite, and it is not an ungraspable canon of works. It is a mode of circulation and reading. If you want to understand the canon of world literature, you need different sets of reading that can be appropriate to all text. So the variability of a work of world literature is one of the main constitutive features. Damrosch has extensively described the text from classical literature as well as the modern unnoticed texts that are across the world. And Damrosch, after demonstrating the literature of different countries, has set a threefold definition. First, talks about that the world literature is elliptical reflection of national literature, and then talking about the world literature is writing that gains in translation, and says that it is a set, it is not a set canon of text, but a mode of reading, a form of detached engagement with worlds beyond our place and time. and this in the same way, Boidi Bhattacharya have raised another way, another alternative idea, and that idea is actually dealt with an argument raised from the two current literary fields, post-colonial literature studies and world literature studies. And according to Boidi Bhattacharya, post-coloniality is the prehistory of the present celebration of the world literature. So this argument is narrated in this book through two different ways. The first trend is the close reading of the well-known author of the world literature like Rudyard Kipling, whose writings are based on the structures and the texture of the empire. And the second is the capturing the energy of the changing nature of the world literature in the writing of the post-war Anglophone authors like Nagpal, Koyerji, and the others. So this book offers also a new post-colonial literary theory in the world of world literature for our time. This book focuses on the particular genealogies of the host of concepts associated with the world literature and reveals their complex entanglement with the colonial and post-colonial histories. And okay, then I would go to the next part, and that is the vernacularization is another name of world making. Here I actually have written on two vernacular poets, and they have they are also called as the world poets. We can say that Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, and his concept of world making. Here Tagore in his speech in Vishwa Sahitya tries to foreground that idea of world literature by emphasizing the manifestation of human soul in its diverse, variegated, multiple images of self-expression. Man is always remaking himself to voice in the universe, to realize himself in the many. Whenever a man has experienced the being of all men, the pain of every man through his being, he unknowingly forms an idea of worlding. So to understand the world samsara, world family, one has to understand the human family. So to know oneself among others is the natural disposition of human soul. So how does man link to the others? These questions help us to understand the reality of the world, and there are three ways to link the reality of the world. So there remains no calculation. The reason is we try to find ourselves among others. So Tagore's world literature is the literature of the multi-self expressions to capture the sense of humanity among others, to recognize oneself by experiencing many. Now, when I was talking about the Tagore, there is another, Bengal poet or a rebel poet, Kazi Nazrul Islam, and his idea of Bottoman Sahitya or contemporary literature based on the recent critical intervention of the idea of worlding of world literature. The vernacular literature has done a splendid task to be included in that domain, and various local literatures have been translated to enrich the templates of world making. So my study on Nazrul's Bottoman Sahitya would reflect, or contemporary literature would reflect, the notion of planetarity across the world. Nazrul, being a rebel poet, a prominent Bengali poet, has written an essay, and that essay engages the prolific authors and their ideas of his own time to deliver the message of worlding to his people. He tries to ground the differences between the dream and the soil. By soil, he means the ground embracing the dusty earth with great affection. So Nazrul's contemporary world is full of intertextual references which ignite the realm of thought to delve deep into the current situation happening throughout the whole world. And Nazrul's idea of world are unique in that way. So he gives the references, sometimes Yeats, Rabindranath Tagore, who soar high in the sky, look for heaven as a dreamer. On the other hand, he mentions Gorky, Boyer, Bernard Shaw, Benavente, who embraces the realities attached with the ground. So in the middle of the essay, concept of destruction and as well as concept of resurrection are being addressed to highlight the upcoming reformation in the paths of revolution. He portrays the capitalist and the greedy tentacles and compares them with our great mythical figure, Ravana's with 10 hands. His soul cries out, listening to the sadness of Metrovsky, or yes.
Sorry, but your time's almost. Could I ask you to
only 1 or 2 minutes?
1 minute.
Okay. Sorry for now. What Rabindranath Tagore in his Vishwa Sahitya conveys a similar message in understanding oneself in the soul of others. Nazrul does the same while he asserts, "My eyes close as I listen. in the dusty earth, I fall asleep listening to the praises of beauty as per for the new sun. In the new morning, in my dreams, I listen to the bulbul birds of Persia, the whistle of the camel driver in Arab, and the beautiful candle-like bodies of the veiled women of Turkey. So to conclude, I would like to say, I can say that the process of world making is the best process to actualize world literature, and it will not, it will only be possible when a planetary thinking and vernacular articulation will be recognized across the world. And Nojrul rightly says that even though I was born in this country, in this society, I don't belong to just this country, this society. I belong to the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm giving right over to you because there are a few questions and I think we are short on time.
Yes, so the first question is by Indrani. And the question is, could you elaborate on the configurations of planetary and world literatures vis-a-vis translation?
Yes. When I am making point on the planetary thinking and on the world literature, I have borrowed the term the planetarity to include the sense of the worldliness. And when you are talking about that the way of translation, what is the role of translation, and Damrosch have already mentioned in his book what is world literature, that literature is the world literature is like that gains in translation. So what I am thinking that, okay, that when we are translate any text, we are helping kind of a we want to generate that kind of idea to as a foreign date, where Franco Moretti have already mentioned the word the foreign date, and to enrich, to develop the others. So in this way we can say that the planetarity, or the sense of planetarity, or the sense of to disborder the way of imagination that can make a sense of the literature, and then that literature would be would be in the domain of world, like that. I don't know I am making sense or not.
Thank you. So since we have about 4 more minutes to go, can we take another question? This one is, can you elaborate more on vernacularization and world making?
Yes, vernacularization and world making. When I am telling the vernacularization, that means I am trying to engage the way of vernacularization. The vernacularization, there is a different concept in classical meaning, but now the vernacularization is is like that. We can say that it's the regional text. We can say that the desi or the local text. So these texts can help to counter that notion, the existing notion of the world literature. What is the existing notion of world literature? That is Eurocentric. That is, if we look at the Rudyard Kipling text, that we are Indians. Being Indians, we came to know our history, the Indian history, by the text of Rudyard Kipling. We came to know the history, our territory, our political, socio-political, cultural history by the text of Rudyard Kipling, and not only we, the whole world. That's why our text, our vernacularization, our Indian, that vernacularization will counter, and that will generate a sense of worldliness. That's why I am engaging with the text of Rabindranath Tagore and Kazi Nazrul Islam, and they have mentioned in their text that kind of sense, that sense can generate, that sense can proliferate, that kind of meaning, that meaning can include the all sorts of literature. There are all sorts of literature, all sorts of literature of multi-language ideologies. There might be the different language ideologies. So, but we have to acknowledge, and that is the main purpose of the recent engagement with that world literature.
Thank you. So I think if there are no more questions, and since we managed to wrap up just in time, we'll proceed for a 1 hour, 30-minute break. And we'll be back at 7 for keynote address by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. I thank the presenters and the chair for this wonderful session. Thank you,
Dr. Yogan, for taking our time and giving us your input, sir. And thank you all the presenters as well. And thank you, Nida.
Just a second.
I think yes, there's
just a second. First, let the chair conclude.
Oh, sorry.
Please let the chair conclude.
I'm really sorry. I have not. It's probably my fault that I didn't properly read, schedule. So thank you so much for this this session. I'm really excited to see papers, particularly in when we can follow where languages go. I hope that we hear more about this. I'm sure we're going to hear more about this. And I see you all hopefully back in a few minutes after the tea break for with the lecture by Sudipta Kaviraj. Thank you so much and enjoy your tea break.
Thank you, Dr. Yogan.
Okay, we come back again at 7 p.m. IST. Okay, after a short tea break.
1 hour, 25 minutes.
Yeah, 1 hour, 25 minutes.